So welcome everyone to Independent Thinkers on Digital, a series which seeks to gain insight through some incisive dialogue with some of the world's leading independent thinkers on matters related to digital technology. I'm William Webb. I'm the CTO at Access Partnership and fairly well known, I think, for my willingness to challenge conventional wisdom and to cut through the hype. And indeed, we've got guests that are going to do exactly the same. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Feasey. Richard currently chairs merger inquiries at the UK Competition Authority, as well as doing some part-time consulting and writing. He's worked inside the telecoms industry for 25 years, including 12 years as the policy director at Vodafone, where he was responsible for overseeing their engagement with regulators and other public authorities around the world. He asked me to stress entirely appropriately that everything he says today is in a personal capacity and not attributed to any organisation that he's associated with. So today, I'd like to dig into the whole question of operator profitability, both fixed and mobile, but I think it's probably most pertinent for mobile operators. And we've had this claim in the last few years from a number of operators that basically they're not making enough money. Their returns are below their cost of capital. They're finding it hard to raise money to make investments. As a result, they can't do the sort of things that governments would like them to do, roll out 5G faster or expand their coverage area. And they're starting to ask regulators whether some of the over-the-top providers, the Metas, the Googles and the Microsofts and others, want to pay them for carriage of their data in order to help restore that case of their profitability. So I'd like to delve into this whole question a bit today. And start off by asking, Richard, first of all, whether we believe that. Is it true? And if it's true, do we care? Is it something that we need to worry about particularly?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, William, and that kind introduction. So I think, I mean, in measuring returns is relatively straightforward in terms of the revenue side of the equation, but working out what the capital base or the asset base is, and the way you value that in the mobile industry or indeed in the telecoms industry is pretty challenging. So I think all of these numbers ought to be approached with a suitable kind of degree of caution. I'm also conscious that when you think about returns in this industry, indeed in any industry, you're normally thinking about the position of the people who are still in it and not the returns that have been extracted by those who have exited. And in this industry, that matters because we have a long history, certainly, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States, of acquisitions where people may have overpaid quite handsomely, and that goes into the asset base when you're talking about these kinds of numbers. So, but notwithstanding that, I think there's a case for saying that returns in the industry, sort of generally on average, are probably lower than they have been in sort of previous historic eras. I mean, the question is, what does that tell us? So one thing it might tell us is that the present has not turned out quite as people were forecasting in the past. I'm not sure that matters very much to the extent that those investments have already been made. I mean, I remember a time previously in the sort of 2G era many years ago where the future didn't turn out as we expected either, but on the upside, there was people earning enormous returns on capital, far in excess of what had been forecast. Yeah. So it cuts both ways, and all that's saying is this is an industry where there is some degree of risk, which I don't think is a great surprise to anybody. I mean, I think where it does matter is it's sending signals to investors about where to allocate their capital, and what you might see is some reallocation away from telecoms infrastructure into other potentially more valuable, more productive parts of the economy. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. No. In fact, if we were to try and create a framework in which capital was constantly allocated regardless of the returns that people were expecting to make, that wouldn't be a very high-performing kind of economy or a very attractive situation. So I'm pretty relaxed, and I would be pretty relaxed if I were a policymaker about it, because I don't believe the primary objective in these circumstances should be sort of maximising capital expenditure.
Which makes a lot of sense to me. But does that then cause the concern I think governments have is then that you don't get the investment that they would like to see, even if it's not necessarily the investment that the operators would make in a logical business case kind of point of view. And of course, we see governments pushing quite hard for 5G deployment to happen faster. Perhaps that's easing off a little now, but it's certainly been the case for the last few years. For better coverage, for better network reliability, all sorts of things that they want, I guess, from a social point of view. And the operators are saying, well, we can't afford to do that. Now, maybe they'll say that anyway, even if they were making more money, because that would be an economic investment for them. Is it perhaps time for governments to start thinking, well, instead of just asking for this, we need to fund it or do something specific to bring it about?
Well, I certainly think that we have got a bit confused in this industry, particularly in Europe, I would say. I would say things are clearer in the United States and perhaps in the United Kingdom and other places around the world. But in Europe, we have got confused between what the purpose and function of the market is and what the function of politics and policy is. And it seems to me that CEOs in the telecoms industry have begun to talk as if they're policymakers, which they're not. And policymakers have begun to talk as if they're investors, which they're not. And I do think getting clearer in the debate about what the market is expected to do and exists to do, and is it functioning well, and what role there is for policymakers and politicians potentially in stepping in when the market fails, or when the market fails, or at least fails to deliver in the way that is required for sort of democratic and social reasons. But I think we're getting those two things very confused often in a lot of this debate. So we are saying the market is failing because it delivers 90% coverage. What the market's doing is delivering what people are willing to pay for, essentially, and consumers and businesses. And that tells us something. And then there is a question about, are there other reasons for the taxpayer then putting their hand in their pocket to fund some other additional investment beyond that?
I think that's that's absolutely right. I look at my mobile bill, which I think is like £12 a month, for which I get pretty much unlimited everything. And it works pretty much everywhere I go now. I don't tend to trek into the wilder beyond. But I think to myself, actually, for £12 a month, that's a pretty stunning amount of sort of value that's being delivered to me. There isn't many other things that for £12 a month provide me with quite so much. So I think I agree that actually it probably is a situation where the users are getting what they want, but government and perhaps the CEOs think that they want something more, or have their own purposes for wanting something more. And perhaps it's worth teasing this one through on 5G. And you and I talked a lot in the past, and you helped me out on my book way back in 2016, for which I was very grateful. That actually there really wasn't that much evidence that the end users wanted this stuff, but government certainly wanted to push it. And it looked like the mobile operators were somewhat keen to push it, or at least didn't want to stand up and say, it's not a good idea. Why do you think that happened? What was going on there? Why weren't those CEOs keen to say, we don't want to spend another, 10% of our income on rolling out 5G when we don't see a business case for it?
I mean, to some extent, you'd have to ask them. But I think the industry has got itself into a situation where it thinks that there's large parts of, I think, the industry in Europe in particular. I think, again, there's differences elsewhere in the world. It thinks that there is commercial advantage in aligning closely with political objectives. And the way I would characterize it is that, and this really started in about 2010, when post the global financial crisis in Europe, the European Commission adopted its first set of targets, the digital agenda targets. Subsequently, we've had all sorts of other targets. It's become very popular after each sort of economic crisis to adopt targets. And the industry, I think, thinks that these can be used to leverage gains in policy that can be translated into essentially returns ultimately to investors. And that's not an unreasonable commercial strategy for people to adopt. But it carries with it some risks, because if you then fail to deliver against those expectations, then it raises all sorts of questions. So I think it is, strange, really, that and slightly problematic that we've got into this sort of set of expectations and interdependency. And I think it would be better if CEOs talked about revenues and costs, and what their commercial challenges are. And I think, we may come on to this a bit, but I think fundamentally what we're in the telecoms industry, and have been for quite a long time, is essentially a kind of restructuring of the value chain. Initially, because services became separated from networks and the old sort of integrated model changed. But now, because, if you like, control of networks and infrastructure is being separated from the tangible, the physical assets that you need. And these are sort of painful, difficult processes to go through. There are lots of kind of frictions and transaction costs in getting out the other end. But the industry needs to do it, because ultimately that's about using capital and resources more efficiently in the future than it is being used today. But there are real costs and challenges to that. It may mean that traditional telecoms companies are significantly smaller and less valuable at the end of that journey than they were in the past.
Yeah, I've sometimes thought that you could envisage a world where a mobile operator basically ended up just being 100 people project managing its network, which was built on masts owned by others and serviced by its suppliers, Ericsson or Nokia. Its core network was sat on the cloud and run by AWS or Microsoft on its behalf. And it had MVNOs that dealt directly with its customers. And all it really needed to do was coordinate those entities in such a way that the data flowed between them. Now, of course, that would be a dramatic change from the operators that are sometimes closer to 100,000 people than 100 people. And as you rightly say, it's really hard to get there from where you are at the moment. And I guess what we don't have is the forcing function of a new entrant coming in and doing things dramatically differently, a Tesla, if you like, coming in and disrupting things completely, because it's so hard to do in the mobile space, because you've got to get spectrum, you've got to build your network. It's really tough to come in with a different business model and disrupt the existing players. So they sit there kind of knowing they've got to change and gradually changing. They're selling their masks off and so on, but fighting that change because nobody wants to get smaller and essentially downsize for whatever reason. So it takes a long time.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. And I think, in a way, the more fruitful conversation would be about what are the impediments and the barriers, what are the transactions costs. Some of them are political. So there are political barriers in Europe to creating greater scale cross-border and issues around that. Some are labour-related, as you say. It's difficult to, right size in, if you're a large European incumbent, these are quite significant and real challenges. Some about a bunch of legacy things. I think an industry which has, the average sort of tenure rate, I think, of people at senior levels in telecoms companies, people have tended to be there quite a long time. This is typically conducive, I think, to sort of rapid change and radical thinking and rescaling. So there are some real meaningful challenges to, I think, as you say, directionally getting faster towards where the industry is likely to end up. And there's some uncertainty about some of those things. But directionally, I don't think it is that complicated. It's not obvious that retail assets sit well with owning steel. or copper or fibre.
Yeah.
There are some big restructurings that need to happen. Neelie Kroes made a speech in response to demands for similar reforms that we're seeing today in Europe. 10 years, in 2014, I was reading it this morning, called "Adapt or Die," and there's some truth still in that. And the industry, although it talks about becoming techno companies and so on, it all looks pretty familiar to me.
Yeah,
at the moment, relatively speaking, given the challenges that they face.
Yeah.
So I agree. I think there's a lot of change to come. Understanding what the real barriers to that change, of restructuring the sort of supply chain, is really where I think policymakers should be focusing their attention.
So I'm going to come back to that, because I think it's worth us delving into a bit exactly what that would look like. But first, and you touched on this, and it's something that's always in the back of my mind. The US seems to be different. At least the monthly fees, monthly ARPUs that the users pay are much higher in the US. And as a result, I guess the US mobile operators seem to be more profitable than elsewhere. You mentioned perhaps there was less political interaction, or at least the CEOs there were a bit less political. Do you think that's the main reason for that difference in ARPUs and competitive positioning?
I'm not sure that's the main reason. And I'm sure the CEOs in the US, just to be clear, spend a bit of time in Washington. I mean, I having spent a lot of time when I was at Vodafone in Verizon's Washington offices, they have pretty significant involvement there as well. But I don't think my point there was just that I don't think the policymakers think they are directing the industry as to the outcomes of the market in the way that I think we're seeing in Europe. It's a fascinating question. As to with essentially the same underlying technology, the same access to people and the other sort of resources. It's not obvious there's anything that US operators have access to that is denied to anybody else. They're somehow able to, it appears, generate significantly more healthy returns. I think there are some sort of technical reasons, if you like. So one, I think that we often underestimate is the sort of history of postpaid or contracts in the United States, relatively low prepaid levels historically, and I notice still today relative to Europe. I think contract pricing tends to sustain sort of consumer inertia, makes price comparison more difficult. There are a number of reasons why that drives higher revenue, I think. I'd observe as well, at least looking at the recent kind of work by analysis made for Etno, the European operators group, the usage is about 50% higher in the United States. And, the macro factors are the US has typically, at a macroeconomic level, done much better over the last decade than Europe, and started from a higher base in any event. So the macro circumstances are more favourable. The tailwinds are more favourable in the US, and I think customers are a little bit less price sensitive, partly again because of this contract pricing effect. And there may well be a scale effect finally, which is relevant to other parts of the world. That just running a business with 75 or 100 million subscribers is just a different proposition from one with 20 million or 10 million. With my Vodafone background, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. It's quite hard to untangle quite how those scale effects work and quite what they are. Yeah. But I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't something there that's kind of material.
And there has been more allowance for mergers in the US, I think, than elsewhere. We saw T-Mobile Sprint a while back, and there's been other kind of changes. Of course, there have been some mergers elsewhere, but it feels like the market is a bit more fluid in allowing operators to chop themselves up and move around a bit than perhaps elsewhere.
Possibly. As you say, the telecoms industry, certainly in the United States, they had a sort of period of structural separation. So there's been some more quite radical interventions. I mean, I'd also say, though, that the operators in the United States have, it seems to me, sometimes taken greater risks. I mean, AT&T has had a pretty significant adventure into going upstream and buying content businesses.
Yeah.
Verizon bought Yahoo and so on. These are so there's a series of quite complicated factors, I think, that mean the US market is quite different. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's any one thing is the short version of my answer, but there are some things to sort of think about, I think, coming out of the United States.
And just to put to bed something that I mentioned right at the start, I'm guessing from what you've said, and certainly it's the way I feel, that you wouldn't have much sympathy with the proposal that the over-the-top providers should pay 42 billion euros or whatever it was to the mobile and fixed operators for carriage anytime soon.
No, well, I mean, just if you take the US situation where you have 50% more traffic, so, on that logic, the likes of Netflix or whichever over-the-top player you wish to choose, is even more culpable in the United States, perhaps, than in Europe. It doesn't seem to be a problem for the US operators. So I think it's a slightly. I mean, I was involved in it to some extent the last time we had this movie, which culminated really in Neelie Kroes's adapt or die speech at the end, where she essentially said no. I struggle to see the logic. To be clear, I am not unsympathetic to the idea that if the market doesn't extend to deliver outcomes for some people, some parts of the population, there shouldn't be a very heavily policed subsidy regime that targets additional public money at that, and maybe all businesses or beneficiaries should contribute to that subsidy regime. But beyond that, I don't see any very good or compelling arguments.
Mm. So we sort of talked about the need for perhaps a change in policy guidance or direct policy from politicians, from government departments, from regulators, that would then help the operators potentially shift to a more sensible approach. What would that look like? Would it essentially be the government and the regulators stepping back a bit from saying, look, we really want 5G, 6G, or whatever, and essentially saying, it's a competitive market, get out there, do what you like, we're not going to guide you too much in that. And then perhaps if, for example, the regulator felt more coverage was needed, it might actually just acquire that coverage, essentially, to some degree, like it has with the shared rural network in the UK, although that's partly funded by operators. Would it look something like that, or would there be a different outcome?
Something like that. I mean, I think the outlines of some of these things are beginning to be seen. So, the idea that you might not have a competition concern if passive assets were owned by a single vehicle, the industry were to pool certain assets in order to realize capital efficiencies and so on. But that you would still expect to see a kind of business and industry structure where there was competition selling services over the top of all of that. It seems to me that the Commission and others are sort of beginning to move in signals in that direction. But to some extent, the politicians can only respond to what's put on the table by the industry. And I have a lot of sympathy with Kroes's comment that it's to some extent down to the industry to get on with it. And one of the reasons why they haven't, I think, is you asked this question earlier, is we're not quite at a sort of, to use the Google term, code red moment or platform moment. The the industry has seen its returns decline over time, although I notice EBITDA margins in Europe are actually rising and have been for the last 5 years or so, according to Etno. But we're not at an existential point in the industry, and by and large, these very difficult changes and radical changes, in my experience, you need a bit of a burning platform to bring the organisation with you and to actually sort of push through some of these difficult and painful changes. And I'm not sure we're quite there yet. Now, maybe the industry will get there, and certain things that were unthinkable before become unavoidable. I think a few years ago, people would have said, I'm not going to spin out my tower assets. They're a key strategic source of strategic advantage. And suddenly they're worth, 25 times EBITDA spun out versus 4 times or 5 times if they remain in your business. It doesn't become a very complicated question. So I think, but actually, I think that politicians and policymakers need to understand whether there are barriers to the industry restructuring itself. But ultimately, the first step has to come from the industry. We do not want policymakers, coming up with the optimal industry structure. That would not be. That's not their job. And their job is, if there is a gap in terms of what the market is delivering, providing the market is functioning reasonably well, then there may be a role for public money. But then they need to make sure that money is spent well and wisely. But the rest of it is really in the hand. The industry's future is in its own hands.
Yeah, and I absolutely get your point about the burning platform. Or in my analogy, the frog that's in the saucepan is gradually getting warm, but it's not yet got to the point where it's realizing that it's being cooked. It sort of strikes me two possible things could happen, or we could just carry on as we are. And one extreme, data growth could carry on or even grow faster, requiring a lot more investment suddenly to service that growth, if that growth is going to be serviced. And then finding the money to do that is going to cause the industry challenges, and that might lead to discussions around, okay, so perhaps a different structure is needed to create this investment, a neutral host operation, whatever it might be, something that essentially overcomes that issue. The other, which I think is possibly more likely, is the opposite, that data growth slows right down to almost nothing. And the operators are left saying, well, actually, we really are just a dumb utility pipe with very little growth in a market that's going nowhere. At which point they probably do have to kind of look themselves in the mirror a bit more strongly and say, actually, if that's the case going forwards, then we just need to maximize our profitability with what we've got, rather than worry a lot about whether we can grow our revenue base with Internet of Things or vertical platforms or whatever it might be. But we're neither of those two positions yet, and it's not clear whether or when we might be.
No, I agree. I mean, I think there has been a great tendency in this industry, as you know better than anybody, William, to be honest, in terms of this sort of repeat cycle of new generation of technology, find applications, and it works that way around. The industry is very still CTO technology driven. In fact, I would argue quite vendor driven. I think it goes further back than the CTOs in the operators. I think it goes back to vendors needing to or wanting to promote new generations of technology, as that's their role. That's what they're there to do. Go and persuade governments to issue more spectrum. The operators then get boxed into this situation where you've acquired spectrum. You've got to demonstrate that you can derive some return from it. And so the cycle goes. And everybody kind of assumes this cycle goes on forever. And it may be, it just stops at some point. Yeah. And we're kind of there. And the supply chain then moves in a different direction, and user requirements change in certain ways. Yep. But I do think the industry has had this slightly sort of almost zombie-like, the future must be as the past.
Yeah.
And, a more agile sector would not make that assumption. I mean, I understand there are long lead times in technology and so on and so forth, but it does feel to me like there's, as you say, there's some quite serious questions sort of coming up around all of that. But I've always been frustrated by this supply-led sort of model of the industry, really, where it seems to me the vendors sort of box the operators, the customers into a position where really they just have to sort of jump in and spend the next wave of capital before the poor marketing people are then told to go and find things to utilize the capacity or the other capabilities.
Go and talk up remote surgery and things like that.
Well, yes, and that's not a straightforward thing to do.
No, it's not. We're running out of time, so it's worth perhaps just stepping back. I mean, I've really enjoyed this. I think we're sort of agreeing that yes, the mobile operators are probably making less money than they were in the past, but that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. That's just the market doing what the market should do, and it should tell us something. The problem is that some of those involved, the politicians, perhaps some of the regulators, perhaps some of the CEOs, either aren't listening fully to the market or feel that they don't need to because they know better and they want to chart something in a different direction. And that's part of the reason for some of these issues. But the structure of the industry is such that can perpetuate for quite some time before you get to the point where people do suddenly realize we do need to do something different. And that point may well come, but we're not quite there yet. And it's not entirely clear what will trigger it, but it likely will be triggered sooner or later.
I think that's right. I mean, certainly I think this period of the industry aligning itself with political targets and trying to use those to leverage changes to the regulatory regime, one kind or another. I mean, I think that's in my memory, started around 2010. So we've been at it 12 years, 13 years or so now. I'm not sure it's been, a particularly kind of edifying period for the industry, frankly, or particularly successful in terms of actual outcomes. And I am a bit of a believer if you've tried something and it hasn't worked, it's probably worth thinking about trying to do something else and a different approach and innovating in a different way. But it does feel a bit like we're getting just the same movie being replayed, and maybe with different set of politicians and so on, you get a slightly different answer. But fundamentally, I don't think it is addressing the core challenges, which are fundamentally sort of economic and industrial driven as a result of changes in technology and capabilities, which is you can now do things and run networks in completely different ways, and you don't need a sort of vertically integrated end-to-end business where one firm controls all the activities. And really what we need is a new industry structure that reflects that and plays to the advantages and benefits of that, which are, lower costs and greater efficiency and probably more innovation capability, because there will be lots of small firms that can sit off the side of these platforms and deliver new services rather than it being the R&D facility of a large telco.
That's a brilliant way to end it. Richard, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our time together.
It was my pleasure.